like, I don't know, 5 to 10 minutes here of talking to do, and then I'm done, and you guys have time to work on your stuffs. So I just want to talk a little bit about test format here to start. So your test has 8 questions. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but remember the questions from the review and stuff. Those take some time. There's a lot of parts and steps to them. So 8 questions. Things you should be able to do. List the values of A, C, H, and K from an equation. Should be able to take an equation, describe the transformation in words. I'll give you the criteria. You know, like A is greater than 0 means yada, yada, you know, those things. You should be able to calculate amplitude, midline, period, and frequency from an equation. You should be able to write the equation of a sinusoid from a description. Write the equation of a sinusoid from a graph. I'll tell you the parent function I want you to use. And draw a graph and generate the points from an equation. So these last 3 skills here, what do these sound just like? That partner quiz, right? Those are the same 3 questions you saw in the partner quiz. So if it's me and I'm building out my note card, I might arrange my note card based on like the things I need to do each one of these 3 problems. So if I want to take an equation and generate a graph, well, the first thing I want to do is find the A, C, H, and K. To do that, I need to write my function in this form, the general form, so I wrote that down. Then I wrote a couple of notes to remind myself that C is the reciprocal of the coefficient of X, that H has the opposite sign as it appears in my equation up here, and that I need to make sure to factor before finding the H, right? So those are things that I've seen us mess up on quizzes or just in general on homeworks and stuff. We got to make sure we're doing that. On those graphing problems, I'd ask for amplitude, midline, period, frequency. So I'd want to make sure I put those formulas on. And I need to make sure I remember that the period and frequency formula for tangent is different than the formula for sine and cosine. So I'd want to make sure I have both sets of formulas for period and frequency, the ones for sine and cosine and the ones for tangent. And then I want to make sure I have that transformation map, that Cx plus H, Ay plus K. That's how I find my new points. And if you want to include example of doing this, that's fine. But that's kind of the directions that I would leave to myself as to like what I need to do. To go from graph to equation, I'm going to write down, okay, the midline, if I find that on the picture, that gives me the K. The amplitude, if I find that on the picture, that gives me the absolute value of A. And the period, if I find that on the picture, that's going to tell me or give me a way to solve for C. Now, if I need to write a description about like what to look for to find the midline or the amplitude or the period, I might do that, but I would at least want to remember that. And then I wrote a little note that I'm say if I'm writing a sine function, I use the point 0, 0 from the parent function, which is a minimum midline max point, and I compare that to any midline point from the resultant function. The x-coordinate from that point on the resultant is my h, and the type of midline point, that point from the resultant function, tells me the sign for a, right? If they're the same kind of midline point, then a is positive. If they're opposite kinds of midline points, a is negative. If I'm doing a cosine function, I use 0, 1 from the parent function, which is a maximum, and I compare that to any extreme point, either a min or a max, from the resultant. The x-coordinate from the resultant gives me my h, and the type of extreme point gives me the sign for a. So if I use the maximum, a is positive. If I use the minimum, a is negative. If I'm going from a description to an equation, a couple different things could happen. So for each of these, I have kind of a couple of different possibilities noted. So for midline, if I have a max and a min, I can calculate the k just by doing y max plus y min divided by 2. If I have a midline point, the k is just the y coordinate from the midline point. And if I have a free point, I can just choose the free point to be a midline point, so its y coordinate becomes k. For the amplitude, if I have a minimum and a maximum, I can calculate the amplitude by doing y max minus y min divided by 2. If I have an extreme point and a midline point, so it doesn't matter if it's a max or a min, it's just going to be the distance between the y coordinates of the extreme point and the midline point. And if the other option was it just told me the amplitude, I didn't write a note for that because, like, if the amplitude's 5, well, no, what's the amplitude? It told me it was 5. I don't need a note for that, right? For periods, if I have a min and a max, I know that half of the period is going to be the difference in the x coordinates between the min and the max. If I have a midline point and then the next extreme point, whether that's a min or a max, I know the period is, or a quarter of the period is the distance between the midline point's x coordinate and the extreme point's x coordinate. And then if I have a min and a max and then the second min or max after that, I'm going to have 3.5 periods equal to the difference between those min and max x coordinates. I think these were the 3 different types of situations where the period wasn't just flat out given to you. Right? Does that sound familiar for those of you guys that did the worksheet? So I made a note of kind of what to do in those situations. If I have a midline point or a free point, I'm going to use the sine function as my parent. So the x coordinate from the resultant is just my h. And if I compare the type of midline point to the parent function, that will tell me the sign for a. If I have a min or a max, I'm going to use cosine as my parent function. Again, the h is just going to be the x coordinate from either the min or the max. If I use the min, then the a should be negative. If I use the max, then the a should be positive. Again, this is what I would how I would organize my note card and kind of how I would do things is I'd have like the type of problem and the things I need to know to do that problem. Rather than just a bunch of formulas and then a bunch of examples, I try to organize it this way. I think would be more helpful to you. And then a reminder for Sunday, the stuff that's due. We had a delta math that I assigned last week. Don't forget about the delta math. The problem set from last week, I had assigned 1 through 14. And then the other day, I assigned 15 to 26. And then 3 problems from worksheet 4, 2, 6, and 8. 2 problems from worksheet 5, 5, and 7. And then today I'm assigning the review. Any question about the note card stuff or what's due or any of that stuff? Okie doke. I'm going to stop talking. Obviously, if you have questions on anything, if you're redoing problems and you want me to check something, if you're redoing problems and you're not sure why we did something, if you're stuck, if you need advice, if you need help, if you need to know my favorite color, whatever, come up and ask me. I literally have nothing to do, so I'm just literally going to be sitting here and watching you work. Okay?